Thank you, Jirka, for the introduction. It's great to be here. Just a short disclosure at the beginning. Hopefully I won't have to run through that door during my paper if my phone rings, because my wife is due to give birth any day now. So thank you. But I told her to wait until the afternoon, so I should finish my paper. Okay. So I apologize for probably not being as coherent as my colleagues here, because I haven't prepared a full paper. I have just some bullet points, and I'll be sort of talking off the top of my head, but hopefully I'll be as comprehensive as my colleagues have been. From today's perspective, I think we can all agree on the fact that the Marshall Plan was key in sort of igniting this drive for a federated Europe. Obviously, these ideas of a federated Europe have been here since even the Middle Ages, but for modern history, the Marshall Plan was a key component of, a key driver of a federated Europe. We can argue whether this was intentional on the part of the Americans or not. But if we look at the Congress, for example, already in 1947, there was a resolution passed that supported European federation, both on the economic level and on the political level. Right. So there was also George Kennan, who basically said at that point that there are only three alternatives for future Europe after World War II. First is German domination, second one is Russian domination, and the third one is a federated Europe, right? So we do seem to see there a certain momentum and a philosophy or narrative of the Americans actually believing and driving the Marshall Plan as within the framework of the federated Europe, right? So we have Europeans like Jean Monnet, who's coming in the spring of 1948 to advocate for a federated Europe in the United States, right? And he's talking about a United States of Europe, right? So he's using this sort of cognitive shortcut for the Americans to really understand that we are trying to, formulate something that resembles very much the system that you have in the United States. And obviously there were pressures even within the United States, whether the Marshall Plan should be passed or not. Daniel Hamilton mentioned this. Perhaps we can mention the U.S. Treasury, for example, which had some infighting between the U.S. State Department. It was the U.S. Treasury that was sort of a little bit afraid of a federated Europe, that it might, in the future pose a greater economic competition, obviously, to the Americans. But generally, the Marshall Plan was, the major policy innovation of the Marshall Plan was, in fact, that U.S. aid was not funneled on a case-by-case basis, on a state-by-state basis into individual European states, but that it looked at Europe as a whole, and it made the financial support for the reconstruction of Europe. It made it contingent upon European cooperation, right? We talked about this earlier. Also, this is the instigation of the OEEC, which is now the OECD, right? And this was also a question within when NATO was being formed. Okay, so the United States will provide security guarantees to the Europeans, but made this again contingent upon their own sort of cooperation, right? So, but what I want to look at in sort of my brief speech is a more historical perspective on how Americans perceived the European interstate system. I'd like to look at some of the first political thinkers during the American Revolution, founding fathers, on how they perceived Europe. Because in a way, and I will revert to some very sort of historical simplifications, but the Marshall Plan and then, this federalization of Europe, or whatever we can call it, is a culmination of what some thinkers, particularly Thomas Jefferson, for example, thought would actually happen in the future through the example of the United States, right? And I will explain this point as I go along, right? So, a brief sort of theoretical academic introduction here. Some of you have probably read David Campbell's famous constructivist work, or post-constructivist, whatever you call it, called Writing Security. And one of the takeaways from his book we can take is that he notes that U.S. policy, foreign policy in general, has always needed some kind of an other, right? Some kind of a relational other, an ideological other within his foreign policy. And it's not just the United States. He focuses on the United States, but we can apply this to all, basically all nations around the world, right? So, and if we look at it historically, if we look at the American Revolution, and according to historian Jürgen Heideking, he says, well, first ideological other in modern history was Britain for the United States, right? During the American Revolution, this was the culmination of this anti-British sentiment within the emerging United States, right? Back then, Britain was obviously viewed as this empire, as sort of an avatar of Rome, okay? It was a fading empire from the perspective of the Americans. It was a despotic empire, obviously, right? So the UK sort of becomes this first ideological other for the United States, but more broadly, it is Europe in general. And it is the interstate system in Europe that is actually being othered by political thinkers and the founding fathers of the United States, right? So the problem with the interstate system in Europe, from their perspective, is that it's based on this sort of Westphalian nation-state model and balance of power system, which causes the endemic disturbances and instability within Europe, the endemic wars. And these wars also, they expand into the European empires, okay? So this was the problem that the first political thinkers of the United States saw with Europe. And so when the United States reaches its independence, the key question is how to avoid the problems that are endemic in Europe, and how to avoid these in creating a new sort of interstate system, intercolony system or whatever, in the emerging United States. And so the question was to avoid two extremes, okay? And again, this is to cite historian David Hendrickson, who identifies these two extremes, when forming the role of the federal government in the United States and the competencies of the federal government in the states, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea was to avoid two extremes. On the one hand, it is the extreme that Hendrickson calls empire, consolidation, despotism, centralization. Okay, and obviously this was, again, what the Americans viewed that existed in Europe itself, right? It was these despotic countries that, led to centralization, empire, etc. And the United States wanted to avoid this because obviously we have a very strong federal government. Then we might go back into the sort of problems that we had with the British when they were dictating us what to do. So avoiding this phenomenon. The other extreme was what Hendrickson calls anarchy, dissolution, chaos, and disintegration. Okay, so that's the conception of the federal government that is sort of too feeble, too weak, right? And the problem with having a federal government in the emerging United States that would be too weak was that the Union might eventually dissolve, and the European balance of power system, Westphalian nation state, would come back in, right, and create the disturbances it causes in Europe and sort of transform them or transport them into the United States, right? And you can read this in the Federalist Papers. If you look at Federalist Paper number 19 or number 20, you can see that Europe, and historically European confederations like Germany or Italy, were being viewed as sort of very unstable and very problematic systems, right? Because they were weak, they were feeble, and their dissolution caused an increased balance of power and being for power from the part of the European countries, right? So this is the other extreme that the Americans wanted to avoid, right? Being fragmented and sort of inviting the European powers to come back in and install, quote unquote, the balance of power system that was so unstable from the part of the founding fathers, right? So the alternative system that the Americans have elaborated, after the Articles of Confederation had basically failed, where they were more on the extreme of sort of chaos and disintegration. So a stronger federal government came in, but this system, this alternative to what existed in Europe, is by some called the Philadelphia system, right? So the Philadelphia system is created within the United States. It's supposed to provide more stability, but also more breathing power for the individual states, and it's supposed to be sort of a functioning alternative to what was the interstate system in Europe itself. So after that, obviously, you have again discussions among the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, about where the United States should be heading in terms of foreign policy. We can just remind of the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton is saying, okay, so now that we're a consolidated sort of nation, we consider our state, we can now join actually the balance of power system in Europe. We can become a part of it because that's where the action is happening, right? We need to be part of the action in Europe. And Jefferson is saying, no, this is not the way we should go. We should serve as the city upon a hill. We should be the example. And really, Jefferson believed that in the end, the sort of culmination of history, and it can remind us of Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, is Jefferson believed that in the end, all states would become a federation of sister republics. Right? And so this was the discussion between Hamilton and Jefferson. Arguably, Jefferson, in this sense, won, where throughout the 19th century, the United States basically, maybe it was some call it the isolationist phase or whatsoever. It was leading its foreign policy by example, hoping that the example of Republican, the Republican system, as you know, the founding fathers, and not even Woodrow Wilson really used the term democracy, was the United States was always referred to rather as a republic, so that this Republican system would serve as an example, particularly for Europe, but for the whole world, to adapt these same institutions in order to achieve greater stability than was provided by this balance of power system in Europe, right? So this was the sort of way that I believe that the first American political thinkers have framed Europe as an other, right? And that the solution to all Europe's problems would actually be, again, if I simplify it a bit, to adopt the Philadelphia system, right? To adopt more sort of federated system within Europe, because it would become more stable. And as obviously the United States system withstood many turbulences, it was proved right that the system might potentially be more stable than the European one, right? But if we now jump, for example, to the debate about the League of Nations, which was again this sort of Kantian narrative that Woodrow Wilson adopted to Europe and the whole world, again having this federation of sister republics that would work on collective security. And if you look at the discussions, again within the Senate, obviously the senators during the debates on the League of Nations were mad at Wilson for not bringing any of them into Paris, but also some of the criticisms were that, again, if the United States would join the League of Nations, it would be sucked into this, again, to the European mess, to the polluted Europe, right? And these discussions were, sort of raged on again when FDR attempted to become a member of the World Court, which was an institution of the League of Nations. Again, we can cite Senator Homer T. Bone, who says, "I'm a believer in democracy and will have nothing to do with the poisonous European mess." So this is 1935. Again, this notion that Europe and the interstate system in Europe is endemically unstable due to the organization of power, basically, if you simplified it that way, in the region, right? So if I go back to the very first sentences that I was talking about, that the Marshall Plan was in effect really designed in the end to help this federation, a more integrated Europe, both on the economic front and on the political front, then we can basically see this as the culmination of how Jefferson believed that that American power of example would sort of transform other parts of the world. And this was, through the Marshall Plan and the other policies that the United States have applied to the region, has actually been accomplished, right? So Jefferson would probably, it's hard to say obviously, but would probably be happy about how Europe looks at this point, right? So I'd like to, I hope I have been comprehensible in a way, even though I haven't prepared the paper as such, but I know it's a bit speculative and perhaps provocative what I was saying here, but I hope it might spur a discussion now in the auditorium. Plus, I'd like to add one more notion, is that if we look at this longer-term historical perspective, and I'm sorry for taking so much time, then I believe that what we're hearing from people like Steve Bannon within the Trump administration is completely sort of at odds with how the Americans have sort of always looked at Europe. Because Stephen Bannon is, again, looking at Europe more from the let's support the national sovereignty. So he's in a way, if I simplify it, telling that Europe should go back to the balance of power system that the Americans have had such distaste for since the American Revolution. Okay, so thank you.